right, we're going to start this work session on redlining and housing discrimination. We'll start with introductions. Ms. Zalatel, are you here?
Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Zalatel.
John Weddleton. Felix Rivera.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Yes.
Ms. Quinn Davidson is here. Forrest Dunbar. Crystal.
Crystal Kennedy.
Pete Peterson.
Is Mr. Constant? Okay, Mr. Constant's also here. All right, please introduce yourself and then we'll listen to your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. My name is David Reamer. I'm a historian, and among many topics of personal interest, I've been researching, writing, and publishing about discrimination in Anchorage, housing discrimination especially, over the last 4 to 5 years. And I was asked to come here and speak about discrimination, so I decided to run with that as I might. Redlining, covenants, environmental justice, everything else, housing discrimination is meaningful. The fun thing about Anchorage is it's hated everyone from some point or another. Beginning with the Bohunks, these Central European immigrant laborers that were forbidden from living within the town site proper, or participating in the town site option. This would have been Czech, Romani, or Hungarian specifically, but it was more generally used by any American being a European of certain low culture, which they took to mean Pole, Romanian, Slavic, Greek, and Italian. These people were not allowed to buy town site lots. But the railroad did want their labor, so it let them settle in a place between C and Barrow Street, just south of what's now the Park Strip, but not within the town itself. Let's just say no Jewish goods.
Wait, I'm sorry, can you go back there for a second?
Okay.
That's it?
At the bottom is the important bit.
Oh, no, kikes, good time.
Yes. Here's another twofer. No women, no natives, from a classified ad in the newspaper. There's another one.
This town's newspaper?
Oh, everything I'm going to be telling you is from Anchorage. Here's another one. No gays, dopers, smokers, children, or pets.
So, but when were these published?
You want to know all of them? I was actually going to ask you to guess this one. Does anyone wager a guess what year the No Gays or Dogs?
75.
2009.
84.
What, really?
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn.
The Bohunks, 1915, with the founding of the city. The No Jewish Goods, no goods from a Jewish manufacturer, 1926. Natives and Women, 1948. This one, 1984. Civilians and Whites Only,
What year is that?
1960. When you say a specific year, this stuff is there for decades. So the specific year matters less than the fact this existed through the 80s. So, Anchorage was also the site of a landmark case about being able to rent or not wanting to rent to unmarried couples, the Swanner case. But these are the most explicit issues. For people living in older Anchorage, this is the more common way that you would run into housing discrimination. Not only were these run in the newspapers for decades, but they were also gathered in local clearinghouses of information. The state housing authority even gathered this information and had a referral office that you would go to get information where to rent and where landholders would go to put their ads. And until 1961, until ended by Governor Egan, they specifically asked people when they brought in their ads, do they want to restrict them? The fun thing about this is the papers reported on this. They reported on the classified ads in the newspapers that they were publishing in the same issues. So there was this odd minimum where they acknowledged it and they kept on doing it.
So this is the Anchorage Times, right?
Anchorage Times, a little less than the ADN. So the other way that housing discrimination would be most explicit, yeah, I'm admitting that, is housing covenants. Literal, those of you who don't know, the extra agreements at the end of deeds to maintain the contract. And this is the first one that I was able to find introduced into Anchorage. These were more common in America during this time, but really originated in the 20s. As a response to the Great Migration, this mass movement of African Americans north and west out of the South. And this is a way to try and contract people, to convince them that not just now, but in the future, you will not let this community, individual neighborhoods be polluted as they would have seen it. So the first one, Coffey subdivision, this is in North Star now. This was Edward Coffey, multi-term territorial legislator. His adopted son is Dan Coffey. And from there they begin to spread slowly at first. Anchorage in 1941, still really small. It's doubled with the addition of the base personnel. But restrictions during the wartime means the city doesn't really grow much. So 45, I don't see any of these being added into deeds, deposited at the recorder's office. 46, I see 12. 47, I see 29. And 3 years after that, 1950, these have spread throughout most of Anchorage. Mr. Weddle.
What did you physically do to find these?
These are recorded digitally. They're in the records office.
So you're just
It's all
flipping through
online.
every plat in South Edition, every plat in Fairview?
Wow. It's time for 10
This was many
It's
hundreds
everywhere.
of hours of research.
How much?
Hundreds of
I
hours
bet.
over years.
If I might, just
Yeah.
a quick break. You mentioned the Swanner case.
Yes.
When was that?
That was finally heard by the state Supreme Court in 94, which ruled that you could not discriminate against unmarried couples.
And did that case go to the federal courts?
It was appealed to the Supreme Court, but they did not hear it.
Was that Joyce Baker?
I can't recall.
So I believe that was my landlord for 15 years. And just as a matter of interest to some, I was fighting the battle for LGBT equality during that time. And her husband said to me the day I rented from him, I would never rent to a gay or a single woman. I will not have someone living in sin under my roof.
That is what he said. He wanted no sign of impropriety.
So single men.
Yeah,
They're
well,
cool.
he was okay with single men or single women, but he wasn't okay with gays or unmarried women. I guess he wasn't okay with single women. Anyhow, so it just as a matter of trivia, I was the only person in this town I was not out to. And it was very uncomfortable being in the newspaper for fear of losing my home, which is one of the reasons our non-discrimination policy going into effect provided for me directly amazing relief, like unmeasurable relief.
And what he's also going to is this, I don't want to rent to unmarried couples, has been weaponized against gays, against LGBT. So, the funding that this is spreading, you find these in Spinard, which very ironically compared today was mostly a white paradigm. 1960s, Spinard is 2% non-white. Sand Lake, Turnagain, North Star, South Edition, some in Fairview, Apartment Heights, Airport Heights, Nunaka Valley. This is the city at the time.
Wait, did Nunaka Valley have these? Because Nunaka Valley, wasn't that originally almost all Air Force housing?
A little bit.
Okay.
We're talking like almost across the road into the west, the border of Nunaka Valley, the other side of Boniface.
Okay. All right.
So the fun thing is that at the same time that these are spreading through, they've already been rendered legally unenforceable. 1948 was the Supreme Court case of Shelley versus Kramer that ruled housing covenants of a racially restricted manner could not be enforced by government. They were very specific in that point that they could not enforce it. They technically left it open that you could willingly engage in these contracts person to person. But if you wanted to break that, the state was going to back you up on that. You couldn't take them to court, although this was then tried. And there were companion cases in Shelley versus Kramer, which was St. Louis, I believe, that did enforce this rule over a non-state territory, specifically cases in Washington, D.C. So you saw me mention Dan Coffey, you saw me mention Edward Coffey, a multi-term legislator. If they're not legally enforced, they're socially enforced. And those with a local prestige and influence, maintained or by inaction, condone the continuance of this system. And these developers at this time, these are the legends of Alaska. I see their names on stuff. These are mayors, these are legislators, these are members of the state bar board of governors, the first one, and a future governor. The biggest developers at the time were involved, Muptuck Marston and Wally Hickel. Wally Hickel made his fortune at this time, made his political career out of building whites-only neighborhoods, living in a whites-only neighborhood in Turney. So these covenants were a conscious act. They're not just copying legal terms that they see in contracts from outside. These evolved. These were personal decisions, personally written. And you can see these really well in this example. Elsa Wheeler subdivision. This is around Benson and Spinard, Dankeridge, where REI was. So, and the Wheelers, Nicholas and Elsa Wheeler, were Matanuska colonists. So you see in the oldest one, they simply just say we're not going to sell anyone of Negro descent. They then revised that deed for the sole purpose of correcting that covenant to mean no person other than Caucasian for 50 years. And then their deeds in the subdivision shortly thereafter that dropped to 50 years. Explicit, conscious acts. So, I mentioned part of Fairview. There was a minority community of African Americans that was pushed and coalesced within southern part of what's now Fairview. It was all Eastchester at that time. But this part, south of 15th, down to the creek, was the flats. It was Eastchester Flats. And it was a red light district. It was the place where you could get every sort of thing, from the most bouncing jazz to the best women to the best booze that you couldn't find anywhere else in town. But it was also a place of family. I've talked to people who grew up in the flats. They remember it, a place where they felt safe. Other people joke about crime, they talk about bullets, but the people who lived there, they swam here. They grew up here, they felt safe. They were sheltered in a way.
David, if I might, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a shameless plug right now. The Fairview Community Council, in partnership with the Parks, is working on a master planning project for the Eastchester Park, which is basically where this piece of land ends in the creek. And one of the conversations we've been engaging in is how can we really robustly commemorate this history there? Because it's been wiped away through stories I'm sure David's going to come to. But you will see coming before all of us a conversation about how do we tell this story meaningfully so that it's not lost in the dustbin of history, but instead is celebrated as one of the things that shaped Anchorage.
So again, this was black-owned businesses. This was a black voters block, as something they would be very upset about once it was destroyed. The first black church in Alaska was created just a handful of blocks north of Greater Friendship to service this community. Their congregation would eventually be scattered. So they wanted to be annexed. Unlike some of the communities around them, they actually wanted to join the city at this time. And they're annexed in 1954. They vote in favor of annexation. They want services. They want water. They want school buses to come pick up their children. Streetlights. 10 years later, they haven't gotten any of this. I've talked to these people. They walk to school. They walk to Denali. They walk to Fairview Elementary. They, regardless of the weather. They didn't have running water. They had trouble getting electricity. Garbage pickup, that's a joke. But this is why they joined the city. But when it came time, this land became increasingly more valuable. This had been the most undesirable land. I mean, down the bluff going to the creek, body, mosquitoes, let them have them. We want to go live on the bluffs. We want to go live by the inlet. Cool, let them have it. But as the city keeps expanding and filling the bowl, this land, its proximity to downtown, to the Spinard Center, becomes much more eye-catching. Plus, they've already done a lot of the work in draining it. So they don't give them those services. But then they say, and this was in a publication that was mailed around the city, although not to Eastchester, they got a different sort of paper. And they said that the people in Eastchester just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want streets or sidewalks or running water. They thought these people didn't have a hierarchy of needs. Their needs started with being left alone rather than running water or school buses. This is the complicity of the city and the state housing authority. land was purchased against their will, and it was leveled and built into denser housing and a senior center. The people in it were scattered. They were given their little bit of check, but this was worthless land. Look at your rundown house with no running water to it. We're not going to give you a lot of money for that. So they didn't get a lot of money for that. Mr. Weld.
You know, you would have many hillsiders express that thought. They don't want paved streets or sidewalks or sewers or water on the hillside or any other improvements, street lights or water. They want to be left alone. So that's current thought.
Yeah, but they want police up there when they need them. They
Yeah.
want to be able to call for those services.
But the things listed here are not high priority.
But again, as I said, these people explicitly, it was the point of annexation. And the city explicitly, the city manager at the time said, we will get you water as soon as you're annexed.
And I think, if I might, the difference is the level of privilege. So these people wanted it, and the game was played around them to tell them they can't have it, but your mansion's up on the hillside and all of your big estates, they're like, leave us alone. They can drive into this and get all the privileged benefits that they want through the power of their wealth. These people, though, all they had was to scrap under their feet and what little we would deign to give them in terms of education, because we were forced to, and we screwed them. And in some ways, as you know, I argue, we continue to do so.
Okay, please continue.
Quite right. They had tar paper shacks. They had material they stole from this military dump that used to be where the greenhouse is above Crazy Horse, between Eagle and Gamble. They would go in there and get materials to build their houses with. So this is the borders of the urban renewal area. So you can see 15th, it's kind of hard to tell, that's 15th at the very top, it's the creek at the bottom, and Ingra at the left. Industrial, it's a dump. This is the area that was bought up and cleared and made into the new housing. The name itself erased. When Eastchester Flats was annexed into the city, the people of what are now Fairview voted to have their name changed to avoid any association or confusion. Fairview was a meaningless name suggested by a realtor. It had no ties or meaning. It was a pretty name. And by the end of the 60s, this is all gone. So I was also asked about redlining. Redlining is a very specific form of housing discrimination. This is your classic redlining. Literal lines on the map that banks, other lenders, insurance companies would draw to say who we will and will not lend money or extend services to. And it's, of course, very coded, which is a sign of what they knew they were doing. So, the red is the most interesting. That's the hazardous. This is Seattle, 1936. That red area in the middle was a historical black community. At its peak, something probably like 80-90% black. Completely gentrified now, of course. I think it's in the teens, last time I looked. Now, redlining is almost impossible to prove unless you get things given to you by the banks from their records. I cannot prove, because of that reason, I cannot prove that redlining occurred in Anchorage. I have anecdotal accounts saying the banks wouldn't lend to us, so I could never improve my house. Therefore, it was in a bad shape when the Housing Authority came knocking to evaluate it and see how much money they were going to give me. But I'll never be able to prove that redlining happened in Anchorage. Just minorities happen to coalesce in certain areas. Stories.
And restricted covenants.
Covenants is a very separate thing from redlining. So these days, redlining is somewhat curtailed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. This information is all available online, broken down by demographics. And it's definitely not a complete solve. Anchorage itself went through a period in the late 80s or early 90s where prominent African Americans in town, churches in town, were unable to get loans. And in the early 90s, the forerunner of the currently revived Black Caucus intervened. It was one of those odd moments where the banks themselves realized they were missing a group of customers. And they literally went to, for example, Greater Friendship in Fairview, who they previously denied, both as a church and the pastor individually, loans to expand their holdings. And asked them, how do we approach the black community? And he said, give me money. And they paid it off in a third of the time and had a wonderful party. The land they bought with that was sold recently last year next to Valley of the Moon Park for that new school. Or daycare, I forget exactly.
It's a Head Start program.
Head Start.
With the residential elements around it.
So, the 2018 study that was done nationally was looking at the state of redlining, still found disparities between lending, racial disparities. But the bid for Anchorage, there's some small sample size issues, but they didn't show anything dramatic. There are minorities get further loans, but the rate that they're asking and being denied is not itself notable compared to any other class. The number of applications is not good, but not the rate of denial. What you see more in the last of these days is not racial, but urban versus rural. You're more likely to get a loan for a business in town than out in between.
I have a big comment on that.
Yeah.
I was on the board of Credit Union 1 for a number of years, and there is an issue there, but one is the collateral. And if you have it in town, you can go get it. If it's in a bush village, we give a loan on a snow machine, you're totally out. If you do it here, you can get some money to sell it. So there is a real cost nexus there beyond that they're rural.
It can be explained, but there is a disparity. So these have been more explicit versions of discrimination. The far most common, the kind that continues to this day, is just we just rented it. Oh, we don't have any places. You saw our old ad online. We haven't updated it yet. We just missed it, man. And these are across decades. The 1951 quote, they could be more, forward in those days. Mahala Ashley Dickerson was a pioneering lawyer in town. She had trouble getting a spot for her law office. Eventually she settled on 15th. And only because the guy had been a Hitler youth in the 30s and was feeling a little guilty about it. In the time pre-World War II, when there were pro-Hitler youth camps in America. He wasn't like a Hitler youth in Germany. No, he was an American Hitler youth. And so this last one's a woman I interviewed. She grew up in the flats, so she was so sheltered. She didn't actually realize what was happening when she went out and started living as an adult in Anchorage. I didn't know why every place I went to was already rented. And it took her many, many years to figure that one out. Another issue about housing discrimination as I flow through these is environmental justice. So environmental justice is the concept that everyone has equal right to the good land. The land that's not polluted, the land that's geographically stable. I mentioned that the flats wasn't the most desirable land as they saw it at the time, bogging mosquitoes. It was, however, quite stable. So when the 64 earthquake hit, they were just fine. The black newspaper in town called it the Passover. No African American homes were torn down. No African American businesses collapsed. That lawyer I mentioned, she called it the white man's earthquake. Jet Magazine even covered it. The black church in Fairview was running weddings that weekend just fine. So this was the odd incidence of reverse environmental justice. Normally it goes the other way. 27 Mississippi flood, Katrina, 1946 Vanport flood outside of Portland. Minorities tend to suffer disparately from environmental catastrophes. This only served to make the land obviously more valuable and more appealing for development. This helped speed up the process of urban renewal. And these all had very obvious costs. Going against these things, going against trying to counter housing covenants, trying to circumvent them, trying to find an ally that would break covenant and sell to you. These had very real repercussions. Some of you may have heard about the house in 1950 in Rogers Park that was burnt down the day before the family was to move in and integrate so-and-so to him against the covenant, and they waited. And the fire department happened to get there and watch it burn. He didn't leave Anchorage. He actually stayed, worked for the railroad, made his money, and still is. He died only a year ago, but ended up with a lot of property, just more outside of town or out of the edges. And the homes was where they would go for it. This minister, he just led a peaceful sympathy march down Anchorage. This was the same time as King was marching in Selma. It was peaceful. EPD chief was marching in front with him. As soon as he got home, though, this is in Mountain View. Peter, again, this is right by the Boys and Girls Club. That's where they went for. That's where they went from, at the house, daring to live here. Policy implications. City and state has never acknowledged, let alone reckoned with its complicity in the destruction of the minority neighborhoods. There are plans, but this has not been a public reckoning or acknowledgement. Those racially restrictive covenants, those are still in the deeds. You don't get to just cut out parts of contracts. They're, Mr. Welch.
Mr. Webb.
Well, this is a great presentation. I know Chris had kind of broached this before, and I've seen pieces, and I think in some of I read with you, but the practical thing of going through, kind of what you did, I guess, each plat and removing these things, it would feel good, be nice, but they can't be enforced anyway, but does each plat have to go through plat again? That would be
There is
unbelievable
legislation, if you want a copy of that, has been done in other cities.
How is it done?
They literally did this digitally, if I recall. I would have to go look at the specifics. I can send them to you.
So they go to call it up digitally, put an X through it, call it up digitally?
Mr. Constant and Ms. Salaton.
And they definitely don't really keep the paper documents anymore. It's all digital, so the process would be digital. And I have long contemplated driving an effort to do this. However, parallel to this, for me to support this, would have to be a documentary project that creates a permanent record in an archive that shows where these covenants existed. Because and I do want them removed from the formal documents. I think there's nothing more offensive than seeing these title documents, these plats, and then having a document on top of it that says racially based policies will not be recorded or retransmitted by the title company, whatever. It would be nice, but not without recording it somewhere for posterity, because it would be easy enough for generations to come along and say, this didn't happen here, and there's no proof of it. And so at this time, there is proof. I'm supportive of the proof being stricken from the record, but I want to see it on a website and in the archive somewhere that shows forever who we were.
So a copy of it would be fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Constant, Ms. Salaton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is really a little bit mind-blowing. I probably live in a house with covenants that would restrict my daughter from living in it. My daughter is African American. And on that first point there, this has really been, she's 8 years old, in 3rd grade, very strong sense of self. But she has mentioned that we do not have a black neighborhood in Anchorage, like she sees when we go to Dallas, where she's from, or other places, and that really weighs on her. She loves that there are all kinds of people in Anchorage and that there's great diversity, but she is really looking for her community and her people, as she puts it. So it is really interesting. I mean, you can go and join groups, and Black History Month is great, but in terms of like going to like this place where she feels completely represented is missing, and it's really complicated because we do celebrate our diversity in Anchorage, but there's diversity and then there's I don't know, community, representative community that you can go find easily, other than just maybe in a special event or an event.
So the most diverse communities in Anchorage is that famous most diverse in the nation research, Mountain View. Mountain View is not by accident this most diverse community. You may have noticed I didn't mention them when I was talking about the neighborhoods that had housing covenants. This is the area that tended to get lower income, tended to be even starter homes before Fairview started to gain that appellation. It was the one where the poorest whites couldn't escape during the 80s crash. And if you want to speak in terms of environmental justice, this is the low income, this is the diverse neighborhood, this is the neighborhood where they stop class when the jets fly overhead because they can't talk.
And the highways go right through there.
Mountain View is created. This isn't a shining point for the city. I'm amazed at that sign, that weird sign they put on the entry into the neighborhood. It's a creative that they're not, mixed throughout the community. It's a relic of this, of where, their parents, where people like them before could not have lived.
Okay.
But about the house with your child, there's a house in South Edition I very much enjoyed driving past. I know very much. It was one of my examples I've used in my research before that has those covenants that a black family lives in. I always want to ask, but it's such a terrible conversation to start off with.
Is this the end of your presentation?
I had one more.
Yeah.
So, if I may.
Sure.
So, policies with significant punishments, they have to have teeth. You may have wondered, what happened to that what about the Anti-Discrimination Act? Alaska was the first. That was a political act. That was a political act many times more than it was an act of policy. If you've ever read it, it's 2 little paragraphs. And as written, it had massive loopholes. It was unenforceable and had to be revised within a handful of years. The only case of it actually being applied and there being some penalty, the man just paid the little fine and was like, whatever. Literally said whatever into the paper. A hotel in downtown England. And the territorial governor, Greening, he knew this. These were people that were coming to him to complain about it when they went back for the revision. But you can tell it's a political act because it was the point that he used on the path to statehood. Look at us, we're already getting rid of discrimination because we have the act. He used this in his books he wrote and published during the 50s. He said there were no challenges to it, which he knew was a lie because they had been in his office. He had taken the pictures with him. But that didn't help his story of Alaska being ready for statehood. This was a political ploy. It's the same way that they already had her vote ready when Elizabeth was giving her speech, why they didn't record her speech. This was a political thing. It was a little thing that they did on one day, patted themselves on the back, and went on their day with it. 68, they try and have a fair housing statute in town. The council just writes it on their own. They tell the black community, literally, do not talk. We do want you here. You can go ahead and leave chambers if you're going to have any trouble with it. There was no input. They wrote it. They did it. They clapped their hands because that was the spirit of the year. I literally don't know, how many people, firms, or whatever have been face some sort of financial repercussion from the statute on the books in Anchorage now.
Sorry, we have a question from Ms. Davidson.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for being here. Chris and I went to a National League of Cities presentation a few months ago on this and came home and reported a bit. There weren't as many members here, and your presentation is much more comprehensive and related to Anchorage, so I'm just really thankful that Chris organized this to kind of continue that discussion. Can you go back to the prior slide? So I'm really interested in acknowledging this history in Anchorage formally with our body, but I'm concerned about removing language from historical documents, mostly for the reason Mr. Constant highlighted, which is I don't want to lose that history because we need to remember it happened, and I think some of the things that are happening in our country right now, we're forgetting what happened prior. So what do you have practical examples of what other cities and states are doing that take other forms that are not just, digitally marking out the history, but are actually proactively saying this is what we can do through code changes or through whatever to make things better in our city?
Code changes have happened. The history of it is not going to go away. You remove them from the deeds on file now, especially if you make a copy of it. To get to that point, you would have to go through enough to get the public attention on it. Piss some people off. There is no fun discussion to be had with leaving it there.
I guess I'm asking, what are other things we can do? So we've sort of discussed that option, but I want to know what else we can do.
That's the primary one, is acknowledging and removing.
But there must be sort of systemic implications from that history that we're now living with, you know, the makeup of Mountain View or other communities. What can we do, since you're an expert on the history of this and sort of where it led us to, what can we do to change that now? And I mean, it's a big question, it's complicated, but I'm just wondering, since you seem to be an expert, if you can think about that. It doesn't have to be right now that you answer it.
Well, that's the total bundle of all the different variables that play into socioeconomic status. And there is no concise answer to
If I might.
Well, hold on, Mr. Welton's in the queue, then we'll go to Mr. Constant.
You know, I'm just saying, I mean, beyond scratching off of an old plat, you know, however you do it, but and I don't know if in platting you can even allow to do that, but you can amend the plat, and that would be the way to go, is you can amend the plat. It's all these plats that say this. We are now amended where that is no longer enforceable, and you can add some flowery language that says, and this is why.
A lot of them are the deeds, though, and you probably have to get the original signatories to. I don't know how you do that.
That will
I can
happen
send
over
you
time.
how the legislation and how that was being worked out. So.
Great.
And what we do, I think, though, that we start a really robust conversation, like literally by creating a monument to the history and telling the story in a very visible way that acknowledges what has happened. And boy, that'll be like hot as hell for us if we try to do that. I mean, just try naming Martin Luther King Road in this town and remember what happens. And so it did happen eventually, and it was a much smaller road, and it was a compromise that was born after
no homes on it.
massive battles, right? And so if we were bold and brave enough to engage in this conversation, I think it starts by putting a mark in Eastchester that is real and tangible and forever. And it might be shot at, and it might be scraped on, and it might be done all kinds of things to it. But I think we engage with the survivors of the flats and have a conversation. How would you use this land to tell a story? And then let's tell that story, because we have a duty. And then we can get into the subtle policy questions of amending all of the plats in one fell swoop. Again, my only caveat being that we record which plats and what they said. So we have what you did here, but comprehensively. Anyhow, that's what I think our action is, in my opinion, and you will probably see something coming forward to that effect in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I'm sorry, you want one last slide?
This actually was the last slide, if there's still time.
Yeah, of course.
This was just one last thing I was going to bring up, is that racial antipathies increase as the economy worsens. This has been a very robustly proven point. New research every single year, new examples every single year. So when the economy crashed in Alaska in the late 80s, although it's not as well documented and viewable, this many years later, there were a litany of events. Synagogues were vandalized. African Americans were murdered by Julius Marshall. Schools, all of a sudden, kids started going to school in the late 80s and early 90s in Anchorage, dressed in, imitating the white supremacist clothing. They were wearing these boots with red shoelaces that meant the blood of the white patriots that had died. This had made it into the schools in Anchorage. And so as the recession in Anchorage continues, there are a lot of militia groups keeping a very close eye on this. They like to join in. They like to be there and watch it. This one in particular, they're very open about this stuff. They don't think they're wrong. So they often see little reason to hide. They quietly like to mingle in demonstrations and rallies. They love going to Black Lives Matter stuff. Just a last point I would like to bring up. Any last questions?
Yeah, any closing thoughts or questions for this?
Just to say thank you. This is one of these heated conversations that I continue to have. In our last work session, we're talking about the MTP, and in it, they have a nice map of where poverty is, but they've removed the specific projects that were in the previous MTP that would provide some relief to it, because those people can wait. And it's super frustrating to see this pattern reiterate itself every 5 years, every year. And I'm grateful that there are people who are keeping the stories alive, because they would otherwise be dead and gone.
John?
I would challenge that coloring of the MTP 2040 because what they've done is moved it to a fairly well-off, mostly Caucasian neighborhood who is not supportive of this thing, right? And the Midtown congestion relief.
Yeah, but they're doing that to make it like more convenient for people
Don't
from
call-
the south side to get
Don't call my
downtown
street
quicker.
Caucasian. We have people of color on our street.
Perhaps, but that's more.
But see, there you go, there's the impression of the neighborhood.
But the problem is, again, these transportation projects, just like any number of other major projects, continue to hammer the people with less means and less power where we concentrated them, which is in the neighborhoods of poverty.
So David, could I ask, you know what would be really interesting, and I don't know if you're willing to do this, but I would love to see a map of Anchorage that has on it, you've identified where these covenants are in these places where people of color were excluded. I would love to have a map that has sort of like just shading and maybe like a little bit of, or whatever it is, and a little bit of like this, like your little pull quotes that has this. Do you think you could do something like that for us?
I mean, that's all of Anchorage.
Okay,
So,
that's tough then.
yeah, I mean.
Well, you said it wasn't Eastchester, it wasn't
wasn't the
Mountain
flat
View.
specific.
But I don't think many people in Anchorage know about this stuff, and I think it would be a really good way to communicate to folks. Here's a map of Anchorage, and here are where these covenants existed and what the covenants said. I don't know if you have the time and resources, but that's something I would love to see.
I have actually worked for 3 years in a row now with the professor at UAA who has kind of published that theory on Mountain View being the most diverse neighborhood. And I've asked him for student help to do exactly what you just suggested, which is capture as many of those covenants in as much detail as we can on the map.
Yeah.
And it is just a time and labor intensive process, and so without funding it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But 3 years I've been pushing on that.
It wouldn't have to be like, I don't imagine it being like exhausted like a GIS map or something, but just something that had, you know, a graphic that had representative examples in Spenard, in South Edition, in Sand Lake, that pulled out the kind of quotes just like you did here and let people understand like, oh, this was a common phenomenon in a lot of the city, although not so much in Muldoon either, right? I mean,
Well, Muldoon wasn't really developed as much at this time.
right.
And what about Green Acres?
Green Acres is a whole nother thing. That's a tiny little area. Oh gosh, what is that? Tudor and Lake Otis?
36 and Lake Otis.
Yeah, 36 and Northern Lights and Lake Otis in that little section there.
Yeah.
That was a little area that had seemingly allowed a lot more black investment. There was actually like some streets in the subdivision that were named after black farmers.
And it might have been, this is apocryphal probably, but the neighborhood where the first folks who were able to buy property, they broke out of the red line and they did it through various creative means and bought that land and basically conducted like a let my people free and started marching them out of the red lines or the prescripted zones and into neighborhoods where they were surrounded by actual white people.
Yeah, that was the hinterlands.
Right?
Ms. Zalto?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You actually, when you said GIS, I think that needs to be a component of, a municipal component of recording potentially some of this information. I think that we have this great resource that I don't necessarily understand how to use it all the time, but I think that historical maps or GIS available through the municipality, I think is a great way to be able to look at some of this information as whoever works on this progresses. Like, I wouldn't discount that. So,
Thank you. Any other thoughts, questions? No? All right, thank you so much for coming, David. We'll end this session and go to the next one.